So I've been asked to speak to the question of whether immigration controls are racist or not. In trying to answer this question, I'll be leaning on my book, Home Rule, to draw on some historical lessons of racism, nationalism, and immigration controls. I do want to warn you that some of the images in my slideshow are disturbing. So a stark distinction is usually made between racism and nationalism. Racism is, for most of us, usually something to be condemned, and if someone calls us a racist, we tend to deny it vehemently. I'm not racist, I'm a good person. Nationalism, on the other hand, is largely valorized, even expected. I love my country, I'm patriotic because I'm a good person. While this hasn't always been the case, and the current consensus on this is wearing dangerously thin, we can now generally agree that racism is bad. But does the racism bad, nationalism good dichotomy actually hold? So let's look at how racism and nationalism both emerged. Historically, ideas of race emerged through the process of class formation. Racism is part of how class rule is naturalized. Wherever there existed class societies, ideas of race were used by the ruling class to set itself apart from those whose labor was the basis of their wealth. In practice, how this worked could vary significantly, but it inevitably came back to the ruling class imagining itself as a different type of people, a refined race as compared to the inferior race of brutes and louts. Ideas of race allowed the very real differences of power and wealth between ruling and working classes to be portrayed as natural, i.e. as biological and or cultural. Ideas that rulers and workers were simply different types of people were inculcated throughout society. Ruling class ideas about breeding, bloodlines, and inheritance have been central to the formation of the classifications and hierarchies that are now understood as race. Not accidentally, acceptance of the ideas of race allowed us to forget the entire social process of how there came to be a ruling and working class. The fact that one group had untold wealth while the others were left wanting was simply attributed to the different immutable characters of different types of people. Think about the old tale of the princess and the pea. Real princesses, countless generations have been told, are so sensitive that a pea beneath many thick and fluffy mattresses disturbs their sleep. Peasants, on the other hand, can sleep on any old hard and dirty surface and get to work the next day. That's just what they're like. Ideas that each of us belongs to one or another race also emerged through the process of state formation. The anthropologist and political theorist James Scott has argued that civilization can be understood as an effect of state power. That is, civilized people are those whom the state has successfully brought under its rule. So-called barbarians or savages remain outside, not yet in state space, not yet ruled over, not civilized, always at the gate. Racial classifications quickly expanded beyond their early polarization of the rulers and the ruled over. Further divisions were concocted and codified in state laws, not only between rulers and those they ruled, but between workers themselves. From the mid to late 17th century in the United States, for instance, rulers co-opted some members of the working classes into supporting their imperial projects by including them in the category of the superior race. Previously racialized as part of the inferior race of working people, European workers were reclassified as white. By law, white workers could continue to be exploited and abused, but they could not be enslaved. In the Americas, slavery thus became a condition that only those racialized as black could be subjected to. The global working class was made and divided from one another through such racialized allocations of terror and mercy. The divisions that the idea of race created amongst workers significantly strengthened the ruling class's power over all those they ruled. Now, because race is merely an idea of who we are, it can come to refer to just about anything. The color of our skin, our hair, our religion or lack thereof, and the language we speak are just some of the things that have been signified as characteristics of our race. This clip is from one of my favorite films, Life is Beautiful, set in Mussolini's Italy. A school inspector is coming to teach children that they, as Italians, are members of a superior race. The inspector is waylaid, however, by the film's protagonist, a Jewish Italian bookshop owner, desperately seeking any excuse to meet the woman of his dreams, a teacher at the school. So I'm going to show you this clip.
Prego, ispettore.
La nostra razza, vero?
È superiore.
Certo. Grazie, la nostra razza è superiore. Appunto, sono venuto da Roma testè ora per venire a dirvi a ciò che voi sappiate, bambini, che la nostra razza è superiore. Sono stato appunto scelto io dagli scienziati razzisti italiani a ciò che dimostrarvi quanto la nostra razza sia superiore. Perché, bambini, hanno scelto me? Ma dico, c'è bisogno di dirlo. Dove lo trovate uno più bello di me? Dove lo trovate uno più bello di me? Giustamente si è fatto il silenzio. Voi avete davanti un'originale razza superiore, ariana purissima. Bambini, partiamo da una cosa che uno magari dice che vuoi che sia, no? L'orecchio. Guardate qua, guardate la perfezione di questo orecchio. Padiglione auricolare sinistro con campanula pendente finale. Guardate che roba! Cartilagine mobile, pieghevole. Trovatemi due orecchi più belli di questi, io me ne vado, per carità, però me li dovete far vedere. In Francia se le sognano due orecchie così. Bambini, le razze esistono. E come? Ma andiamo avanti, vi voglio far vedere un'altra cosa, bambini. Attenzione. Ha detto ispettore? Ispettore? Da Roma? Da Roma? L'ombelico! Guardate che bello ombelico! Che nodo! Ma non si snoda neanche coi denti! Ci hanno provato gli scienziati razzisti! Niente, non si snoda! Questo è l'ombelico italiano della nostra razza! Guardate che roba! Guardate la muscolatura! Cipite, bicipite, tricipite! Guardate che bellezza! Guardate l'anca! Guardate che movimento! Guardate che roba! Signori, io ora vi saluto, vero? Perché me ne devo andare con l'appuntamento, mi è venuto proprio in mente. Io devo fare un'uscita ariana. Io vi saluto, arrivederci l'ombelico! Principessa, ci vediamo a Venezia.
Our hero, like 9 million other people declared as threats to the racial purity of Germany and Italy, dies in an extermination camp. Significantly, the concept of racism was developed in the 1930s precisely to understand fascist beliefs and actions. Robert Miles argues that the concept of racism named a specific discourse which was considered to be abhorrent. Its development represented an important political and ideological rupture in European history. After war's end, the world started to come to terms with the mass exterminations of people said to be members of an inferior race. This included natural and social scientists who went to work to atone for the racist theories of their predecessors. They wrote landmark reports, including this one for UNESCO in 1950. They argued that race was a calculated invention that in no way reflected actual differences amongst human beings. In the few decades after World War II, laws stipulating differential rights and entitlements on the basis of one's race were largely overturned, including those affecting states' migration selection processes. Those who continue to expound racist beliefs about their racial superiority over others are widely condemned and regarded as extremists. As a result, the popular understanding of what constitutes racism associates it only with extreme acts of denigration and/or violence. Yet, racism remains a powerfully violent force around the world. In every place on earth, some people's lives and liberties are valued more than others. How do we make sense of the continued force of racism in the absence of racist laws stipulating differential treatment? The enormous legitimacy attached to nationalism is, I believe, part of the answer. After World War II, even as scientists debunked ideas of race and challenged practices of racism in response to the horror of fascist holocausts, they remained silent about nationalism. It was as if nationalism had had nothing to do with murderous fascist violence. Mahmoud Mamdani, in his 2021 book, Neither Native Nor Settler, shows how the Allies' insistence on treating Nazism as simply the criminal acts of individual perpetrators to be tried, judged, and sometimes executed by the victors at Nuremberg left as unquestioned the philosophical and structural basis for the idea of the nation. This is puzzling, to say the least, for two reasons. First, the Nazis represented their political project as a national reawakening of a slumbering and complacent German nation that had allowed its historical homeland to be polluted by foreign others. The Nazis' racism was enacted as part of their project to purify the German nation through state actions. The 1935 Reich citizenship law revoking the German citizenship of Jewish people is a prime example of this. Borrowing from aristocratic notions of bloodlines, the Nuremberg laws limited membership in the German nation state to those having, quote, German or related blood, unquote. So ideas of the German Herrenvolk, or master race, were manifested by the state practice of limiting national citizenship. A supplementary decree in November 1935 expanded the list of people ineligible for German national citizenship because of their supposedly inferior race. The representation of, quote, gypsies, Negroes, and their bastards, unquote, as well as people deemed to have, quote, mental and/or genetic deformities, unquote, as non-members of the German race was materialized in the law by stripping them as well of their German citizenship. The assumed association between German blood and the loyalty to the German people and Reich served to define all non-Germans living within German territories as deportable. The Nazis' plan to deport those the state made foreigners and enemies of the people failed in no small part because of the immigration policies of other states around the world, who also regarded the victims of fascism as undesirable people in their budding nationalist projects. Irving Abella and Harold Troper documented this in regards to Canadian immigration policies that declared that none is too many in relationship to accepting Jewish people escaping Nazi Germany. It was after many failed attempts by the Nazis to deport them that concentration camps became death camps. Secondly, the silence on the Nazis' nationalism during the Nuremberg trials occurred precisely when the world of imperial states was being transformed into a world of nation states. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the idea of nation emerged in the 14th century and referred to, quote, a large aggregate of communities and individuals united by factors such as common descent, language, culture, history, or occupation of the same territory so as to form a distinct people. With this focus on ideas of shared blood and soil, practices of racism and nationalism were conjoined. Both racism and nationalism freeze history at a time that suits their definition of sameness or difference. We could talk instead about our common descent from our first human ancestors living between 5 and 7 million years ago on the African continent. We could go back even longer, of course. All plants, fungi, and animals evolved from a common ancestor more than 1.5 billion years ago. Indeed, humans share 44% of their genes with honeybees, 38% with roundworms, and 24% with grapes and rice. We could, if we wanted to, talk about Auntie Bee or Uncle Sour Grapes. While a kissing cousin of race, ideas of nation add a crucial spatial dimension to racist practices. From the start, all nationalisms posit that each and every nation has its own place in the world. In the process of arguing that every nation has a territorial basis, a difference is created between ourselves and foreigners. Members of the nation are seen as different types of people who are irreducible and incommensurable to the type of people who are foreigners. Nation states entrench such ideas into their laws. In a world of nation states, those foreign to the nation are and can more easily be turned into non-nationals, and in national law, non-nationals are migrants. People classified as migrants are imagined as people living in someone else's national homeland. Members of the nation thus become a people of a place, while those who are said to not belong are made the people out of place. Yet, just as aristocratic households could not function without the great unwashed washing the rulers and their stuff, in every nation state there exists people made foreign to the nation. Their legal and/or social status as foreigners generally works to lower their wages, reduce their options, and make them the targets for members of the nation, perhaps particularly for those who don't get what nationalists promise them. The social and legal dichotomy between nationals and foreigners relies on immigration laws and border controls. For this reason, it's important to examine the history of their making. Contrary to the dominant perception, immigration controls are not timeless features of states or societies. The first immigration controls in the British Empire were implemented in 1835. These early immigration controls were designed to counter and to contain the victory of slavery abolition movements. The British Parliament finally abolished the slave trade in 1807. Slavery itself was abolished several decades later, starting a year after the passing of the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. For both the British imperial state and capitalists investing in its colonies, the end of slavery led to a desperate search for new ways to secure and to discipline the workers needed to ensure the profitability of colonial ventures. Subjecting some people to state controls on their mobility into places was hit upon as a solution to what states and capital regarded as the problem of the newfound mobility of former slaves. Thus, it is at the beginning of the end of slavery in the British Empire when the category of migrant first appeared on the world stage. The first to be so classified were people recruited through the new trade in quote-unquote coolies, specifically people recruited as contracted indentured workers from the British colony of India to work on sugar plantations in the British colony of Mauritius. In 1835, as planters in British Mauritius sought to recruit workers from British India, Mauritius colonial officials feared that without the disciplinary power of slavery, these workers would set a dangerous example for those who had until recently been enslaved. The two main responses to these concerns were immigration controls and the contracts of indenture. Radhika Mongia has highlighted how in 1835, the local British Council of Mauritius passed two ordinances regulating the entry of workers recruited as coolies from British India. From now on, they would need to demonstrate that they had permission to move from India to Mauritius, and that such permission would only be granted if they produced a contract of indenture, which legally tied them to work on plantations for a specified period of time. Importantly, these ordinances introduced new limits on the hitherto free mobility of imperial subjects within the British Empire. Before then, not restricting the movement of British subjects from one part of the empire to another was heralded as evidence of their formal juridical equality. Claims for the existence of formal equality were not an insignificant part of how the empire quelled dissent amongst the colonized natives. In addition, the government of British India, which at this time was the East India Company, implemented new emigration controls. People recruited as coolies, along with those agents who facilitated their emigration, were required to provide written statements outlining the terms of their labor contracts of indenture before an imperial official. Often written in English, these contracts, which coolies signed, or most often marked with an X, provided documentary proof that coolies were not slaves. Such proof was politically important for the British imperial state and for plantation owners. As soon as the new trade in coolie labor became known, a campaign arose in both the British metropole and in the colony of British India to protect workers from the quote-unquote new slave trade. A special committee was established in 1838 to inquire into the movement of coolie workers from British India. The committee concerned itself with the coerced character of their migration, ignoring the conditions in the colony of British India that might make moving preferable to staying. Emphasizing the helplessness caused by their poverty, they avoided identifying the source of the poverty of colonized subjects, never mind devising plans to end it. Rather than challenging the capitalist underpinnings of British imperialism, or more specifically the conditions of indenture under which coolies were exploited, abolitionists argued that the protection of coolies depended on ending their movement out of British India. The abolitionists were successful for a time. From May 1839 to December 1842, the governors of the East India Company prohibited the emigration of workers engaged in manual labor, effectively halting the movement of workers through the coolie recruitment system. Meanwhile, planters on Mauritius, and by now also in the British Caribbean, worked hard to overturn the ban. By the end of 1842, the emigration of coolies was again permitted, and a year later, almost 35,000 coolies were shipped from British India to British Mauritius. To avoid further comparisons with slavery, however, a protector of emigrants was appointed at each departure point. Likewise, an office for the protector of immigrants was established in Mauritius and elsewhere in the empire. Of course, neither emigration nor immigration protectors actually worked to protect coolie workers, yet they are the foundation for our current national government of mobility. These early imperial controls on immigration fueled the fire of nationalism in both the metropoles and colonies of empire. Immigration controls allowed people to imagine a world of borders between newfound nations. Imperial states were largely concerned with keeping people in their territory, but nation states flipped the script. They largely removed restrictions that had hindered people's movement out, while enacting new regulations and restrictions on letting people in. The first states that we can recognize as nation states declared themselves by enacting new immigration regulations. The earliest restrictions, unsurprisingly, targeted workers labeled as coolies, even if they were not recruited as contracted, indentured workers, revealing how the term coolie had quickly become a racist epithet. Peru was the first state to nationalize its sovereignty, and it did so by enacting racist immigration laws. In 1853, it barred the entry of people from China deemed to be either ill or unruly, followed in 1856 with a ban on workers recruited as coolies arriving from Asia. By 1891, Peru declared that immigrant recruitment would be made up, quote unquote, exclusively of the white European race. The US was also early to nationalize its sovereignty. In 1875, it passed its first immigration controls, the Page Act, banning the entry of coolies from China and, quote unquote, prostitutes. One by one, rulers nationalized state sovereignties, each by enacting racist immigration policies. Each of the world's first nation states were imagined as a racialized political community whose boundaries were enforced by immigration laws. By making the migrant, these laws also produced the national citizenry on whose behalf the nation-state claimed to rule. Both were racialized groupings. The nation was positively racialized, migrants negatively racialized. Nationalisms turned people into the people, who we were told were the real rulers, with the nation-state merely their representative. Nationalism was thus a significant advancement in the abstraction of class and state rule. The people of the nation were not only imagined as a cross-class community of positively racialized people, but also as sovereign, as the state itself. The process of turning classes into masses arguably started with these first immigration controls. Immigration controls and the nationalization of state sovereignty that they mark picked up rapidly over the course of the 20th century. The end of World War I led to the formation of new nation states picking up territories from the collapse of the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires. Given that each national community was imagined as a race of people sharing descent, language, customs, etc., the process of nation-state formation forced large-scale movements. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 led to the expulsion of approximately 1.5 million people, now regarded by the new state as foreigners, who were to be returned to places that the vast majority had never stepped foot in. At the end of World War I, over 1 million people constituted as German were forcibly removed from territories annexed by victorious states. The partitioning of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman imperial territories also resulted in a tremendous culling of people from new nationalized territories. All of these enormously violent events informed the negotiations of the 1923 Lausanne Convention, a settlement of the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 22. Signed by the new Greek and Turkish governments, the convention concerning the exchange of Greek and Turkish populations was the first internationally ratified compulsory agreement for quote-unquote population exchange. It mandated the movement of the, quote, Muslim inhabitants of Greece to Turkey and the, quote, Christian Orthodox inhabitants of Turkey to Greece. Not only were these events a humanitarian disaster of world historic proportions, but they also came to be regarded as a model for future nationalizing efforts and future partitions, including the 1947 partition of British India into Pakistan and India, as well as the 1948 expulsion of Palestinians from the new nation-state of Israel. After World War II, and despite the horrors caused by nationalisms, the process of nationalization accelerated. With astonishing speed, the near global space of imperial states was mostly nationalized. Between 1945 and 1960 alone, 36 new nation states in Asia and Africa were granted either a restricted autonomy or outright independence from empires. By the 1960s, the two most powerful imperial states entering World War II, the British and the French, lost the vast majority of their empires and nationalized the sovereignty of their imperial metropoles in Europe, again by enacting new controls on immigration, this time largely directed at preventing the entry of people from their former colonies. The institutionalization of nationalism as the legitimate basis for state power was enshrined in the 1945 founding charter of the United Nations. Its recognition of the right of national self-determination, or the right to national sovereignty for those people who could successfully claim to being the people, became the bedrock of international law and remains so to this day. Hostility to migrants was bred in the bone of the UN Charter. With its declaration of the rights of nations to self-determination, it could not account for the rights of all those people who were not the people in the places they lived. Those regarded as non-members of the nation were reimagined as migrants, people said to have moved into now national territory at some time in the past, and this often led to their expulsion as well. The dominant belief in how we came to live in this world of nation states is that people, again with a capital P, the people, rose up to demand national self-determination. Such a belief shores up the idea of popular sovereignty, which forms the basis for the legitimacy of nation-state rule. The reality is not that pretty. Throughout the 20th century, the United States played a pivotal role in arguing for the end of empires and for the establishment of the global rule of nation-states. In 1941, with metropolitan France under Nazi occupation and the British metropole under siege, the United States seized the opportunity to demand a reorganization of the still largely imperial world to its advantage. That year, President Roosevelt succeeded in having British Prime Minister Churchill accept the extension of the Wilsonian doctrine of self-rule to the natives of its colonies. Their agreement was sealed in the 1941 Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was far from an expression of solidarity with the colonized on the part of the United States. Rather, the United States stood to gain from the opening of what were closed imperial markets for land, labor, and commodities. Such an opening would be achieved by the transformation of both imperial metropoles and colonies into independent sovereign nation states, each enmeshed in an international regime of financial, political, and military ties. The now nearly global system of nation states fundamentally reorganized the ways in which inequalities were organized and how they were normalized. In this new global apartheid, nationality became a major vector of inequality, injustice, and indifference. With freedom of movement into any given nation state reserved only for those with citizenship in it, national citizenship became a crucial factor shaping one's access to now nationalized labor markets. Just as the United Nations Charter of National Self-Determination organized the political order of post-colonialism, the Bretton Woods institutions, including the IMF, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, which turned into the WTO, established its economic order. Each sovereign nation state, while formally holding the financial levers over its economy, also existed within a global field of capitalist power that was far from even. The sheer weight of past concentrations of wealth meant that some nation states were far better positioned to reap most of its benefits. The United States was best positioned to benefit, particularly as it became a global source for financial capital. The new international system provided the institutional structures for capitalist social relationships to expand dramatically, which they did to a scale and a scope that was previously unimagined. This expansion occurred through, not against, the the nationalization of states, sovereignty, territory, and subjectivity. Claiming to have liberated people, a world of nation states liberated capital instead. In the process, a new global order emerged, one that I call the post-colonial New World Order. Its legitimating ideology is poignantly captured by this proverb. When the axe came into the woods, many of the trees said, at least the handle is one of us. Indeed, in contrast to the promises of national liberation, disparities have only increased in the post-colonial era. There has been an increase in the inequality between peoples from a maximum ratio of 2 to 1 around 1800 to 60 to 1 at the start of the 21st century. In the post-colonial New World Order, the greatest determinant of one's income and wealth is one's nationality. In stark contrast to the situation in the mid-19th century, when the real income of workers in most countries was similar and low, and when much of the inequality between people in the world could be explained between the differences in income between capitalists and workers, today the gap between quote-unquote unskilled workers' wages in rich and poor countries often differ by a factor of 10 to 1. The economist Branko Milanovic has argued that today almost 3/4 of global inequality is due to one's national citizenship. The idea of nationality organizes inequalities because nation states across this international system limit its obtainment. Immigration and citizenship controls work to limit and enforce these inequalities. The idea of a world composed of distinct and seemingly equivalent nationalities is therefore what allows nation states to effect racist exclusions without naming race as the basis of discrimination. In this way, nationalism carries racism into our lives. Support for nationalism and for nation states remains hegemonic across the left-right political spectrum. In the post-colonial politics of separation, the rift created between people categorized as either nationals or migrants is hardening and expanding in ever more uncanny ways. Across the world, a further contraction of the already limited criteria of national belonging is taking place around the figure of the national native. Borrowing from the imperial state category of native as someone who is colonized, nationalists are representing themselves as having been colonized by migrants. This has led to an enormous expansion of the term colonizer to encompass all those regarded as migrants. So even though the state category of native was thought to have disappeared as colonized natives became independent nationals, embedded in each idea of national sovereignty is the notion that true nationals are those who are natives of its territory. These are the national natives. By restricting the making of claims to sovereignty, territory, and rights to those who are national natives, discourses of natural native belonging and territorial sovereignty produce borders even more fortified and difficult to cross than those erected between national citizen and migrant. While it's conceivable, albeit increasingly less so, that one could become a national citizen, it's nearly impossible to become native. Today, claims to national autochthony or nativeness is increasingly important to nationalist projects, both from above and from below. Indeed, placing people into separated categories of national natives and migrants is an incredibly violent process. The legal and or social separation of the two animates deadly conflicts around the world. In Myanmar, formerly Burma, the exclusion, incarceration, and expulsion of people counted as Rohingya is portrayed by its perpetrators as an anti-colonial struggle against foreign invaders in defense of the indigenous people. In 2017, approximately 740,000 Rohingya were forced to flee Myanmar, mostly heading to Bangladesh, where they are detained in refugee camps. Having been socially constituted as migrants in Myanmar, many were forced to flee and became migrants in the law. There are many other stark examples in what have been termed the national liberation states. For example, the deadly conflicts between supposed natives and supposed migrants in Darfur and in Rwanda. We also have the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, the military coups against Asian parliamentary leaders by indigenous chiefs in Fiji from the 1980s into the 2000s, and the expulsion of Asians from Uganda in the throes of Idi Amin's African indigenization project in 1972. We have moral panics over migrant invasions in Europe, which have spurred violence and provided the political foundations for a growing authoritarianism. In the former British white settler colonies, the distinction between settlers and immigrants is also collapsing. In indigenous nationalist movements, every non-native is increasingly regarded as a settler colonist, including most egregiously those groups who were expressly excluded from the white settler colonial project: Black people, Latinx, and Asian people, all of whom can now be depicted as colonizers of indigenous national natives by virtue of their presence on native territory. In the process, the very act of moving is made into an act of colonization. Political membership in nations predicated on ideas of nativeness thus manifest racialized ideas of essentialist origins in territorialized forms. This is post-colonial racism. Today, nationalism is the vehicle carrying racism into our lives. While discrimination is rarely exercised today through racial categories, the edifice of our current structures and institutions is thoroughly nationalist. We have been left with a world then where divisions between workers harden as capitalist social relations expand and the power of nation states intensify. Such a situation allows nationalists of all stripes to make the case that the reason national sovereignty has not yet delivered what it has been promising is the continued existence of foreigners in the nation's territories. What such political rhetoric actively seeks to hide is the fact that nation states, all nation states, are wholly incapable of realizing liberation or justice for the vast majority of people, either citizens or migrants. This is not because nation states don't have enough national sovereignty, but because of the global arena in which capitalism operates and because of the long-standing relationship that exists between ruling classes and state power. Concealing the operation of class-state rule is the work that nationalism does. This is glaringly so with regard to citizenship and immigration controls. Anti-immigrant politics only create more competition within labor markets nationalized through citizenship and immigration controls. This enforced competition spurs on greater nationalism. More nationalism leads to more anti-immigrant politics, which leads to the further cheapening of the labor of migrants, which leads to more competition, which leads to ever more nationalism, more competition, and more cheapened migrants ad infinitum. As Bridget Anderson has very helpfully shown us, while portrayed as benefiting citizens by elevating them above migrants, in reality, citizenship and immigration controls harm all workers by creating a group of people who are legally denied rights and protections within capitalist markets for labor, housing, and more. To acknowledge this is to acknowledge the failure of nation states. To avoid addressing this reality, many nation states endlessly replay the fight against colonialism, for this positions them as the defenders of the nation rather than as the managers of ruling relations. This is why new colonizers have to constantly be produced, and why migrants, the quintessential people out of place, can be represented as colonizers invading native nations. The existence of new colonizers normalizes national sovereignty. I will conclude with a very broad statement meant to elicit your comments. To move from our present of social, economic, political, and climate catastrophe, we need to transform our relationships to one another and to our shared planet. Ideas of race and nation work to legitimize the material differences created in all class state societies between rulers and ruled, owners and workers. Fortunately, history is replete with efforts by workers working across, and more importantly, against the ideas of race as well as of gender and the nation. In the slave insurrection of 1741, for example, enslaved black people and poor white people in the British colony of New York tried to capture New York City. As Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker show us, it was organized by soldiers, sailors, and slaves from Ireland, the Caribbean, and Africa. Not only did these rebels challenge the power of the British Empire and almost took over New York City, they were a few minutes away from doing so, they also challenged racialized divisions. Captured, many were executed. Such efforts at radical solidarity are largely forgotten today as ruling classes and states work hard to naturalize divisions amongst us in a Herculean effort to put down collective action and solidarity. To live in a world where justice prevails, that world needs to be truly shared. A world in common is a world without borders and boundaries that establish differential value and worth of living beings. It is a world in which people are free to move and have the power to prevent their displacement. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nandita. It was really, really brilliant. You covered a lot of ground. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all this evening, and especially to have Nandita here. You know, I read Home Rule when it came out, and it was so enlightening for me in so many ways. It's really, really informed all the work I'm doing now. And it's also really great just to say to have Bridget Anderson here. The two of you, your work has really shaped my own, and I'm sure that's the case for quite a few people in the room this evening. I also want to say, just to add to what Nandita said at the start, just to thank you to everyone who put this together, including Emily Walmsley. I know a lot of unpaid labour goes into things like this, so I really appreciate all of that allows us to be here this evening having these discussions. What I'm going to do just very briefly, and I'm going to try and keep it brief, is speak to some of the themes that I found most useful, I suppose, in your work, Nandita. I'm going to ask a few questions. You don't have to answer all of them or any of them, but just some things for the audience to think about as well. And like I said, I'm going to try and keep it brief, but that is really a tough task, I think, because there is so much rich thinking that underlies your work, and I think gives us a lot of really important insights and points of discussion. So when I was preparing for this evening, one of the things that I was struck by was how painfully relevant your work is for understanding the world around us. So not only thinking historically, but thinking about where we are today, and perhaps focusing our attention on maybe what not to do in response to political events around the world. So yesterday, as I'm sure you are all aware, 51 people at least were found dead in the back of a lorry in Texas, and they most likely crossed the border from Mexico into the US. And it can feel crass or sort of insufficient to point to events like these, because the weight and the meaning of this kind of violence and death is really beyond words. But I do think we should be paying attention to the fact that across the world, people are dying trying to cross borders incredibly frequently. So for example, last week, again, you might well be aware, people died trying to cross the border from Morocco into Spain, and this evening, I mean, I haven't checked the news in the past few hours, but the British government is attempting to deport people once again to Rwanda. So these issues are really present, and when these kinds of things happen, in particular these kinds of deaths at the border, a really common refrain across the political spectrum and across large sections of the media is that so-called people smuggling is to blame and must be stopped. And underlying this idea is that it is illegitimate for certain people to try and enter the country. So the problem that we're told is that there are people who facilitate their entry. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with these arguments, but there is a degree of validity to some of it. So some people are exploited by so-called people smugglers, but evidently is deeply misleading to just focus our attention there. And so to counter these arguments, a small section, I think unfortunately a relatively small section of the left, make the argument that border policies are the things that are to blame. We should be looking towards the border. It is the border that produces death and violence. But I think one of the things that Nandita's work does so beautifully is, and necessarily actually, is takes us further and encourages us to expand our analysis by focusing on the nation state. So people do not die crossing borders only because of border regimes, though I think the border is an important site to interrogate. There is a whole machinery and process of legitimation that makes the border possible, that makes the border necessary. And so our attention, we could argue, reading your work, really should be thinking about the nation state. Without also critiquing this, we risk reproducing the very bordering structures that we seek to dismantle. So it seems to me that one of the animating principles behind your work is inserting the nation state squarely into our analysis, and importantly, encouraging us to see how this relates to racism and immigration controls. So this is brought together in your argument that you just so nicely made, that overt forms of racism have largely been delegitimized, but the nation state has not. Yet the nation state relies on an understanding that certain territory belongs to a certain people. And in this, certain people are defined as national natives, as you said, and others are migrants. So how we relate to nation states is organised by these categories, and in this there is a racially encoded idea of there being a people. So I suppose one of my questions is about conceptualising race and racism more broadly in relation to this. So in the context of, say, Britain, what do you think this does for our understanding of racism when part of the national identity is based on an element of supposed racial inclusivity? So we can certainly identify all of the ways that belonging for racialised others in a country like Britain is contingent. You know, if we just look at the fairly recent Windrush scandal, I'm not suggesting that this racial inclusivity is somehow real or concrete, and evidently it's actually part of national myth making. So the suggestion that the British people are inclusive, there is still obviously an other within this formulation. But my question is more, what does the ability of certain migrants or certain nationalities or racial groups to belong, even if in a precarious way, mean for how we might conceptualise race in this kind of formulation? So that is, not all groups of people experience violence and death in the same way. Not all of this neatly maps onto race as a physical identifier. So whilst I would argue against any kind of empirical, hierarchy of oppression, if you like, my question is more about what this means for us theoretically. So what, if anything, might this mean for how we think about race and national belonging? And I suppose a question that I had whilst you were speaking as well is it worthwhile investigating the specificities of nationalisms, or is this a bit of a distraction? Or should our starting point be that these aren't avenues that we need to go down, the nation state is the problem? And one of the things that I find really compelling is that you direct our attention to countries in the formerly colonised world, and I think some might actually shy away from engaging with or confronting this, but you really show us that instead of the true freedom that could have come with decolonisation, what we've been met with is demands with national sovereignty. And so this produces a system of nation states where the idea of the native, thought to have disappeared with colonialism, has persisted. So as you just explained, what we see is that post-colonialism did not end violent relationships, but refashioned them into nationalist subjectivities. So crucially then, I think you encourage us to pay attention to anti-immigration politics in the so-called poor world, which is not something that is necessarily a place of comfort for everyone who might consider themselves on the left. And one of the reasons for this is, you know, the way that you draw this distinction between the system of imperial states and the system of national sovereign states. In this context, I think you really expose a lot of the left vocabulary is very, very fixated on critiquing imperialism rather than national sovereignty, which in turn lets nationalism and the nation state off the hook. And I think this is one of the main or the key things that we should really take away from this evening, is where we should be directing our attentions. And one of the final things that I want to say, and I think I find this really, one of your focuses that I find really, really welcome, perhaps because it is one of my main preoccupations as well, is that you show and you expose that whilst we're very good at criticising overt right-wing, anti-immigration, pro-nationalism policies in a way that is, you know, we might point to Boris Johnson, we might point to Donald Trump. There is arguably less of a conversation about the way the left supports territorialised, racialised nationalist politics. So if all nationalisms produce a separation between national natives and migrants, as you say, any left movements that are about capturing state power are arguably implicated in this. So if there is a nation state, there will, you could argue, be an immigration regime, and therefore there will be exclusion, because you cannot have an immigration regime without having some form of exclusion. So I think what you do then is you encourage us to think about what left progressive politics should do and say about human mobility, and I think that's a question that isn't dwelt on enough. So I had two questions in relation to this as well, one of which I think is slightly unfair, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I want to know what your response would be. The first, though, is that there are scholars, critical scholars of nationalism, who actually hint to there being an alternative, who maybe don't call for the abolition of the nation state. So I suppose my question is, what would you say to them, the people who suggest that there can be a state separated from the nation? How can we think of that? Is that a sort of plausible way to think about how you go forward? And my slightly unfair question is, what is the way forward? You know, I spend a lot of time thinking about this and imagining that other world where everyone has the right to move and the right to stay if they wish. And I know that this isn't a vision that one person can create, but given your work, do you have any words about the steps to get there, or sort of the hope for us, I suppose, about how we can imagine and explain this potential other world to people who maybe aren't as interested or clued up on some of these issues as maybe your audience here tonight is. So I just want to end again just by re-saying it's such a pleasure. It's really, really inspiring to engage with your ideas and your work, and also just to see someone who is committed to not only challenging our conventional thinking about the nation state and immigration, but who's also part of the struggle beyond academia. You know, your work, I think, makes really, really vital contributions to not only the debate that happens in what is sometimes closed off academic spaces, but actually is really crucial to thinking about how we strategize, how we resist, and how we create that other world. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. It's been a real pleasure to hear you speak tonight. And yeah, if we could just give Nandita one.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Maya. Your work is so fantastic, and you are also making an enormous contribution, so I really appreciate your engagement and making the trip down here. Thank you. You had two questions for me, so I'll try and answer them briefly. There are a lot of scholars who argue that you can have states without nations, and that's actually the next step. I'm thinking particularly of Jacqueline Stevens, and Mahmoud Mamdani recently made that argument. I guess he's always made that argument, but he made it more clearly in his last book. And I would just say that I think I tried to show in my talk that nation-states are a particular kind of problem, but that all states have attempted to control people's mobility, right? So imperial states largely controlled it by exit controls, right? Like, we're not going to let you leave our territory because we need your labor, we need your taxes, we need your bodies as conscripted soldiers, right, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not going to let you leave. And they were not so concerned about who gets in. And in fact, they facilitated the entry of tens of millions of people into their territories as slaves, as quote unquote coolie laborers, et cetera, et cetera. Nation states also control people's mobility, and they do it in an equally violent manner, but they're not so interested in controlling people's exit. They're more interested in controlling people's entry. So just getting rid of the nation part, like that would be an enormous victory, really challenging nationalism and delegitimizing it in politics. But it's not enough because all states control people's mobility, and whatever state would follow would do so in a new fashion that would be violent and horrifying, and then we'd have to organize all over again about getting rid of that version of it. So that's my answer to that. And your second question of the way forward, I really think that the way forward is the commons, and that the commons that we need to create has never existed before, right? Because the commons we need to create is the planetary commons. We've not, you know, and perhaps we had a planetary commons in very fragmented ways prior to the existence of states, and therefore classes, and therefore ideas of race. You know, James Scott has recently argued that states are about 5,000 years old, right? Which is a blip in human history, so that's hopeful. But it's still 5,000 years. So there may have been a planetary commons prior to that point, but we need to figure out who we are, right? Like, and I think we need to challenge current ways of imagining who we are. And if we imagine ourselves as linked to this planet of life in fundamental ways, and to construct systems and structures that are not competitive and hierarchical, the commons is really the only way forward. And the reason I say that is because common, and I hate to use the word rights because it's so state-centric, but the power of the commons, the power of commoners, is the power to not be excluded, right? And that's a totally different kind of power, because private property rights are about the right to exclude, right? Those who aren't the title holder, you can exclude them by law. Citizenship rights are an extension of private property rights. You can exclude people from the national territory because they're not citizens. The commons is about not being able to be excluded. So how we relate to one another when we don't have deportation, when we don't have prisons, when we can't just get rid of people that we don't like, or have defined as undesirable in one way or another, I think it changes everything. And so I do think the commons is a way forward, and how we get there is a whole nother set of questions. I think that the EU is not a non-national project, as it is portrayed. It is a proliferation of national borders, and a strengthening of national borders in a way that wouldn't have happened without the EU. Like, I'm thinking of the wonderful book that Chetta Mainwaring just recently wrote about Malta, right? That Malta has had to enforce borders in a much more stringent way than it would have prior to its joining the EU, right? And that the financial incentives for being at the edge of the EU is a mechanism which encourages states to have even more stringent border regimes than they would previously, prior to the EU, have had. So there has been an intensification of border regimes by each member state than there would have been prior to the EU. So that's an interesting project, to think of the EU as a border strengthening project rather than as an opening the borders project. But at the same time, what's interesting, right, is that the No Borders movement owes a great deal to one could argue that the No Borders movement, if you think of the sans-papiers in Paris, owes a great deal to that imagination that did shift with the emergence of the EU only for EU nationals, right? Those people who had the ability to cross those borders without passport controls unleashed an imagination that possibly made the idea of no borders more politically thinkable, right? So there's always embedded within these regimes of destruction and violence, people figure out a way that they could, reimagine it in a much more liberatory way. So there's always a way out. Yeah, and thank you for that question. And I hope that you noticed that the two representatives of Europe that I put up there were both women, right? Marine Le Pen and Priti Patel, because it also says something about the co-optation of gender into these discussions, right? And the co-optation of quote-unquote marginalized groups into power. So I talked a little bit, and this is a question that relates to a point that Maya also raised, which is, the incorporation of some people into the idea of the British nation who aren't white. And I think if we go back to that period in the 17th century when workers from Europe were being incorporated into the category of European and into the category of white, we have clues about what's happening now, right? That the incorporation of people like Priti Patel into the British nation and into the British state structure we need to see it as a co-optation, right? And it's, no one's going to call Priti Patel white, but they are going to call her a patriotic British national, right? And that should give us a clue about the power of nationalism today and how it brings racism into our lives, right? But through people who allow themselves to be co-opted into that system. Right. I understand that kind of sentiment, and that is kind of captured in the sentiment of the power to stay, right? The power to not be displaced. But at the same time, I would say two things to that. One is that world is not this world, right? And the creation of that world is not possible with the existing structures of this world, right? That world where no one is hungry, no one is being abused. Well, so that's one thing, right? That this world that we would like to have is not possible in the existing structures that exist. The existing structures cannot create that world for us. The second thing, however, though, is that I think we've come to believe that migration is always a crisis precisely because of this world of nation states that we live in, right? Human beings have been moving long before there were Homo sapiens. Before we were Homo sapiens, we were moving, but certainly since we've been Homo sapiens, we've been moving. And it hasn't only been because there wasn't enough food in one place, or there had been floods or droughts or whatever, or war. It is, there is also a happiness to moving, right, as well. It's not only a crisis. It doesn't have to only be about escaping. It can also be a moving towards something that you want, right? And so I don't think I would ever say that my world that I would like to create means that no one is moving, that everyone's happy to stay put, because I just don't believe that's possible. And I wouldn't want us to think of a better world with the ideas of the old world that everyone's just actually happier in their own place, right?
But place is a very powerful psychological, psychological value to a lot of people. I'm an international lawyer, so we tend to think about borders and states quite a lot. And I've always sort of understood nationalism as perhaps a sort of some kind of slightly grotesque expression of our sense of place, and the fact that we like living in communities or places or areas, and which perhaps is behind that speaker's question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly the idea of the nation is an utter perversion of that feeling of place, right? And I think nationalists have purposely taken these ideas of community, et cetera, right, to refashion this new form of state power. So I think it is a perversion and a corruption of that sense of place. But we also have a long history of mobility, right? So clearly we have a history of people being able to have more than one place, right? Like, I like this place, I also like that place. Maybe this place is okay, but maybe the other place will be better. And, you know, like, so the argument is not to have us all be constantly whirling around the globe. Like, that's not what no borders means, right? It just means that when you want to or need to move, no one's going to be able to keep you from doing so, and in keeping you from doing so, make it a world of people who are not free, right? So I really do see no borders movements as a major freedom struggle of our times, right? A major freedom struggle that we are in the early stages of convincing people that this is a form of serious violence and suppression, and the inability for us to move to where we would like to be is a movement for freedom.
Thank you. That's a great place to end, I think, with Bridget's permission.